Chapter 15, The Power of Example. We stated earlier that Jesus has called us to make people into his disciples. I believe we are wrong when we think this will happen all by itself or simply by people attending our church meetings Sunday after Sunday. Listening to teachings does not necessarily make one into a disciple. Jesus was a carpenter, but he did not build a single church. He never started an organization, nor did he have church services at any specific time. Neither did he start a Bible school to get the job done. No, the way he made disciples was entirely different from the way in which we do it today. In chapter 4 of the Gospel of Matthew, we read about Jesus calling his first disciples. And Jesus, walking by the Sea of Galilee, saw two brothers, Simon called Peter, and Andrew his brother, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. Then he said to them, "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." They immediately left their nets and followed him. Matthew 4:18 through 20. Jesus called his disciples with the words, "Follow me." A disciple of Jesus was, and still is, a follower of Jesus. We leave what we are doing behind in order to follow him. Yet what did Jesus do to make people into his disciples? Did he build a church where they could meet every Sunday? Did he start a Bible school where he could meet the students every morning and teach them? In the everyday Danish Bible, there is an explanation of the verses that we just read. It says this: "In those days, teaching often involved following a master and learning from his example. A disciple is rather an apprentice than a student. That is why the disciples and other people often called Jesus Master." There are many truths hidden in what we have just read. In the culture in which Jesus and the first Christians lived, things were done very differently than what we do in our various cultures today. Being taught by someone, then, meant following a master. However, following the master did not mean that you learned by sitting and listening only, but by seeing and doing. It was both teaching and learning by example. Today, almost all learning in the church happens by listening to someone teaching. What makes you a student is mostly sitting and listening to the teachings. It is actually the way our whole society functions. Fortunately, more and more schools are beginning to introduce new ways of learning. They are beginning to involve the kids so that they are not just learning but are more actively involved. Research on how people learn most effectively reveals the following. We remember 10% of what we read, 20% of what we hear, 30% of what we see, 50% of what we hear and see, 70% of what we say ourselves, 90% of what we do ourselves. As you can see, there is a big difference in what we learn between simply sitting and listening, which is what we do most in churches, and talking, seeing, and doing. Jesus taught his disciples by having them follow him. In that way, they did not just experience what he taught, but they also saw how he lived. After they had watched how he did things, Jesus sent them out to do what he had shown them. This is an important part of learning that is, unfortunately, often left out today. The way teaching is done in churches nowadays easily creates a distant relationship between the common church visitor and the pastor or speaker, and that's exactly what it felt like when I was a new Christian. Because of this distance, people often do not grow in the faith. Nowadays, when I am out in the country, I often meet people who have respect for me because of my ministry. It is one thing to have respect for me based on what they see of me on my website or a couple of times each year in a pulpit, but it is something completely different when you talk to me and meet me in the different situations of everyday life. Those who hear me teach only remember 20% of what I say. The people who talk to me each day grow in a completely different way, especially when I am taking them out to practice what they have learned. They are not only taught through my words, but also through my way of life. They are not only listening, but they are also learning by seeing how I treat my wife and my children, how I think about others, and how I spend my time with God, etc. They learn by following me and doing what I do. The church is supposed to be a part of everyday life, not something that only takes place in a certain place for a couple of hours each week. When you consider that most of what we learn actually happens by seeing how others do it, what is it then that we are learning in many of our churches today? Do you learn how to give a testimony? Do you learn how to be a good father or a good husband? No, this is something that is learned in everyday life and not something that can be taught in 2 hours sitting in a church on a Sunday morning. Of course, we can be taught by listening to a sermon, but it is still not teaching by example. What we do learn in church is how people teach, sing songs, welcome others, and many other things that belong to church life. God has not, however, called us to be professional Christians, living a professional church life. We are called to go out and make disciples of all nations every day, disciples who are living the life each day. God has not called us to serve Him only in some small areas of our lives, leaving the rest alone. Being successful in a speaker's chair while the family is falling apart is not being successful at all. No, it is about your entire life. That is why Jesus called people to follow Him, so that through life's challenges they would learn by example. A good picture of the way Jesus and the first Christians lived is that of an apprentice and his master. It is a practice that does not occur as much today as it did some years ago. The thought behind this practice is that the student, apprentice, learns from an experienced teacher, master, by following his example until he becomes experienced and competent himself. How did such an apprentice learn? Well, first of all, by seeing what his master did. In teaching this way, the apprentice not only learned by seeing, but also by hearing and doing. After some time, the apprentice will start trying to do things on his own. However, the master will stay by his side to see how he is doing and to help when and where it's needed. After a while, the apprentice will begin to do things on his own more and more, until finally he is fully educated and able to move on. With the Christian life, it should actually be the same. We follow other mature Christians and learn from their example. After a short time, we will be ready to perform tasks and teach others ourselves. A disciple is not above his teacher, but everyone who is perfectly trained will be like his teacher. Luke 6:40. In the Gospel of Luke, chapter 9, you can read another example of how Jesus taught his disciples. Here, he gives them an order, along with some practical instructions. It says, among other things, He sent them to preach the kingdom of God and to heal the sick. And he said to them, Take nothing for the journey, neither staffs, nor bag, nor bread, nor money, and do not have 2 tunics apiece. Whatever house you enter, stay there, and from there depart. Luke 9:2-4. Everything Jesus is saying to his disciples here is meant for them to learn something specific. Later we read, And he said to them, When I sent you without money bag, knapsack, and sandals, did you lack anything? So they said, Nothing. Then he said to them, But now, he who has a money bag, let him take it, and likewise a knapsack. And he who has no sword, let him sell his garment and buy one. For I say to you that this which is written must still be accomplished in me, and he was numbered with the transgressors. For the things concerning me have an end. Luke 22:35-37. Jesus sent them out at this specific time, So they would learn something specific, to trust God. Later, when Jesus said, "As the Father has sent me, I am also sending you," John 20:21, his disciples knew what this meant. They had seen how he had been sent out by the Father. Jesus was with his disciples for only 3 years, but it was enough for them to then go out and change the world. Today we see Christians sitting in church pews for 15 or 20 years without any big changes. Why? Could the reason be that we have built up a church system that is not capable of training people through example? Could the reason be that one remembers only 20% of what one hears? Imagine a young man who really wants to become an electrician. Of course, he begins by sitting on a school bench listening to a teacher and reading books. But the funny thing is that after 4 years, he still has not actually done anything himself. He has just listened and read without applying his knowledge in any practical way. He has read all the books and heard all the teachings on how this is a redundant statement. It should be done. He knows everything about it. But now the time has come for him to show what he has learned during those 4 years. What do you think is going to happen? Yes, he is probably going to be afraid, nervous, insecure, and will have difficulty remembering all that he has heard and read. He is going to think, what am I supposed to do now? It's not like what I heard and read. What if something goes wrong? He's probably going to turn back because he realizes the gap between the theory and real life is simply too big. Fortunately, this is probably never going to happen to an electrician today. In reality, as a student, he is going to be trying things all the time, and a lot of the lessons will include practical training. After a short time in school, he will begin an internship, where he will work beside someone with more experience until he is finally ready to go and work by himself. The only place where we actually do not learn this way today is in our churches. In our churches today, we simply listen and read without ever gaining the experience of practical application. This is why we have a church that is filled with fear and that will never go out into the real world and do what Jesus has commanded us to do. We know all about how to do it, but we just cannot seem to actually do it ourselves. So let's look at an example. Someone comes to me who really wants to hear about God, and I place him with a Christian who has been attending church regularly for 10 years. I charge the Christian, will you explain the gospel to this person? If he repents, baptize him in water and with the Holy Spirit, and then disciple him. What do you think would happen? I think the Christian would not know what to do. A true and trained disciple of Jesus, however, would gladly make the other into a disciple because this is part of the mission Jesus has given us. Today there is a huge spirit of fear standing between the church and the world. We can only take it away by beginning to make people into disciples on a daily basis like Jesus taught us. Look at Christians who have been sitting in the church for 10 or 15 years. Ask yourself whether they are able to do what I have been talking about. If the answer is no, you know that they are not going to be able to do it in the future either. That is, if they continue in the same way for another 10 or 15 years. We are often so gullible and think that if we continue a little while longer in the same way, things are going to change. I am convinced that if change does not happen now, it is not going to happen in the future by continuing to do the same things over and over again. When we realize that we learn mostly by example, we will understand that it is incredibly important who we hang out with. The truth is, we do not learn most things from listening to the preachers in the church. We are actually influenced more by others we meet in the church and everyone else we relate to in everyday life. It is like the story of a duckling that opens its eyes for the first time. It thinks that the first thing it sees is its mother. In the same way, when you are born again and your spiritual eyes are opened, the Christianity you see around you is going to be real and normal. Of course, this can be changed, but that is not so easy. If you become part of a fellowship where many are living in sin, there is a big risk that you will start to do the same. If instead you become part of a fellowship where people are on fire for the Lord and serve Him in word and deed, then in the same way you will probably be set on fire for Him. The truth is that we learn through what we see and experience around us, and we tend to adapt to our surroundings. It is so important to build relationships with people who are true, burning disciples for Jesus. In the first fellowships, you could not just walk in from the street and become a part of the fellowship. There had to be evidence that you had really repented and were living right before the Lord. The Bible makes it clear that this should still be the same today. We should remove evil from our midst because a little leaven affects the whole lump. 1 Corinthians 5:6. But now I have written to you not to keep company with anyone named a brother, who is sexually immoral, or covetous, or an idolater, or a reveler, or a drunkard, or an extortioner, not even to eat with such a person. For what have I to do with judging those also who are outside? Do you not judge those who are inside? But those who are outside God judges. Therefore, put away from yourselves the evil person. 1 Corinthians 5:11 through 13. This is incredibly important. Again and again I am astonished at how new Christians grow when they are in a fellowship where people love Jesus with all of their hearts. I have seen people going into the streets evangelizing and praying for the sick, people from whom I would never have expected this based on their personality. However, after they had come into a fellowship where many were doing just that, it became natural for them to do the same. What we see of Christianity in the beginning is what we're going to see as normal. So, we have to begin creating fellowships where we really serve Jesus in word and deed. This way, we will learn by what we see around us and truly influence the people with whom we associate.